acknowledge the presence here of some of my father's very dear friends who have taken great trouble to come here, and I am very appreciative of that. Thank you very much. I also want to thank many who have worked with me through my journalistic career as well as in the foreign ministry who are here today, and Mrs. Kadragama who is also joining us today. I deeply appreciate her presence here. And ladies and gentlemen, after Prashanta's introduction, if I were wiser, what I should do is just to say thank you and walk away. Because anything I do from here on in will be going downhill. But I guess I don't have that option, so I will proceed. Mr. Chairman, I am deeply honored to have been invited by the Ananda College Old Boys Association to deliver this annual Olcott Oration 2010. It is at moments like this that one feels so deeply humbled, conscious of the fact that you owe so much to so many, particularly those who nurtured you in your formative years, who shared your youth in a joyous way, who guided and supported you in work and in life. I feel deeply touched to say so many of them in this audience today. It is one thing to have had to put up with me over the years as a student, a colleague, a boss, a subordinate, due to compulsion, but it's an entirely different thing to spend a good Saturday afternoon on a long weekend to come to have to listen to a boring lecture. But I will try my best to do justice for your choice, to your choice. I'm deeply moved, and I'm sure my mother and sister and elder son, who is also an Anandian and here today, as well as my father's cousin who went to school together with him, would, for the fact that I follow in my footsteps of my father in this school. When Tilak Karunaratne invited me to speak, he said that he is doing this also in honor of my father. And I want to share that thought with you. My father served with him on the OBA and had very memorable times in contributing to the development of this school. I'm sure he would have been very proud if he was here today. Another person who, ladies and gentlemen, was born in New Jersey on 2nd August 1982. Having served as a military officer and subsequently a journalist and lawyer, Colonel Olcott founded the Theosophical Society of America in 1875. He came to be inspired by accounts of the Paradura led by Venerable Mohottivatte Gunananda, and was distressed by the plight of Buddhists in then Ceylon, in the face of over 3.5 centuries of domination by European colonial powers. Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky declared themselves Buddhists and headed to our shores to help Sri Lankans. According to historical records, they landed in Galle on 17th May 1880 and took Panchasila at the Vidyananda Viharaya in Galle. After discussions with the venerable monks and assessing the situation, according to Professor C.V. Agarwal of the Theosophical Society, Adyar, Chennai, Colonel Olcott devised a three-pronged strategy to arrest the prevailing decadence, namely Buddhist education, well-planned propaganda, and sound organization. In the years that followed, Colonel Olcott, in addition to being responsible for the revival of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka, was instrumental in founding the Buddhist English Academy, what we today call Ananda College, with the stated intention to provide English education to Buddhist students who would otherwise have had to go to a missionary school in order to get English education for themselves. This was the time, according to again Agrawal, that the British colonial administration was supporting some 805 missionary schools as opposed to 2 Buddhist schools. Given the solidarity he built with Venerable Hikkaduwe Sumangala, Anagarika Dharmapala, D.B. Jayatilaka and others, it could be argued that by the time of his death on 17th February 1907, he had ignited among Sri Lankans both the passion and the organization required to struggle for independence. In selecting a topic for today, I wanted it to be relevant and also constructive. In my choice, moderating competing narratives, the challenge of recasting Sri Lanka's image abroad, while I continue with the focus on the challenges facing our country, articulated by two senior distinguished Anandians who preceded me in delivering this oration, I will deal explicitly with the external dimension. Senior lawyer Mr. Gomin Dayasiri, in the Olcott Oration of 2007, focused on the inherent contradictions faced by the campaign of the LTTE for Tamil Eelam, including their insincerity shown at the so-called peace talks, and predicted the inevitability of the defeat of that organization. Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Secretary of Defense, in the Olcott Oration of 2009, provided us an intimate account of how the LTTE was defeated and the emerging challenges arising from the end of the conflict that needed to be addressed on an urgent basis. My humble attempt today is to reflect on how this victory in restoring peace and security in Sri Lanka can be consolidated through recasting Sri Lanka's image abroad. I wish to emphasize at the outset that the views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the government of Sri Lanka. What is the context? In a very basic sense, although an image is a reflection of reality, we all know too well that images can be manipulated in a manner that distorts the message conveyed to an audience. In reality, there is no single image, but many images of the same object, each one reflecting different narratives, some more dominant than others. I start from the premise that despite the significant amelioration in the reality in post-conflict Sri Lanka, that there has not been a commensurate improvement in Sri Lanka's image abroad. As External Affairs Minister Professor G.L. Piris was to observe recently, Sri Lanka's achievements in constraining the negative consequences that arise in the aftermath of the internal conflict has been inadequately recognized by the world. He was to add that these achievements are not accidental, but the result of properly structured policies. But unfortunately, this is yet to be appreciated in some quarters. Therefore, at this time, when Sri Lanka is well positioned to reap in full measure the fruits of freedom from terror and leapfrog into the future, it is necessary that we make a conscious effort to recast our image to better reflect the changes on the ground. However, notwithstanding whatever internal issues we may have, it is in the common interest of all Sri Lankans to ensure that the dominant image of the country is a more positive one. To this end, in my presentation today, I will first seek to capture the current status and possible motivations of the constituents that shape Sri Lanka's image abroad. I will then try to offer some thoughts as to how we might engage these constituencies in a meaningful manner, understanding their strengths and attacking their points of vulnerability. I will also argue that to succeed in our quest to regain control of the dominant narrative on Sri Lanka, that we also need to learn how to bracket issues on which we can't internally agree immediately as ones which we need to work hard at to iron out our differences while without trying to convert them into foreign policy issues and taking them beyond the border's edge. I remain deeply conscious that my view as to how Sri Lanka can recast its image constitutes only one point of view, one that others who perceive matters from a different perspective must necessarily moderate. My only hope is that we begin a process of forward thinking on this issue in an objective manner which would serve Sri Lanka's best interests. What, ladies and gentlemen, are the constituents that shape Sri Lanka's image? Broadly speaking, I identify 5. First, Western governments, which I define from a politico-cultural standpoint as countries that are geographically located in the North America, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Second, non-governmental organizations, and these include both international NGOs as well as local NGOs who are dependent on foreign funding. Third, Sri Lankans abroad, particularly those living in Western countries. Fourth, those whom I would like to broadly describe as informed opinion makers, where I mean international lending institutions, investors, tourists, academics, etc. And finally, the fifth, in the international media. It must be noted that each of these 5 constituents have weaved different narratives on Sri Lanka, which successive governments of Sri Lanka over the past 30 years have had to grapple with. While being informed of this past, today my focus will be on the challenges that lie ahead. I do so conscious that unlike in the earlier period, we also have a historic opportunity of succeeding, that of not having to fear whether our carefully laid out plans would be jettisoned by the next bomb. As for Western governments, ladies and gentlemen, although much of the current criticism on Sri Lanka emanating from the West is posited in terms of what is referred to as the last phase of the conflict, it would be fair to say that most issues arose over a longer period of unprecedented turbulence in Sri Lanka's contemporary history. Most Western governments believed that there was no military solution to the conflict and that the LTT must be engaged in talks at any cost. Some even had the audacity to suggest that the LTT was invincible and that it would be unwise for the government to try to confront it. A complicating factor was that some others were seeking to find a role for themselves in Sri Lanka's quest to resolve their problems, regardless of the efficacy of the contributions they sought to offer.